Uh, this is a talk to the Libyan Studies Society on the peopling of the Canary Islands, and it discusses the hypothesis that the people who were the original aboriginal peoples of the Canaries were Berbers from somewhere in North Africa. What is the evidence for this, and what are the evidence for the pre-colonial populations of the Canary Islands? Well, the Canary archipelago was known to classical authors, and the date and manner of its peopling still remains very controversial. When the first maritime explorations from the Mediterranean reached the islands in the 14th century, Canaries were still in the Neolithic, i.e. they had no iron technology. Despite evidence for pre-Hispanic contact, for some reason metal technology was never transferred. Even more surprisingly, perhaps, is that the inhabitants, the people called the Blench, had no seagoing tradition, even though we can tell from archaeology that there was extensive inter-island cultural transfers in the past. Until a year or two ago, a lack of radiocarbon dates meant that the chronology of the settlements of the Canaries remained controversial, and indeed the literature is full of wild guesses. The aboriginal inhabitants of the Canaries, the Blench, were basically killed off in the 18th century. This is a genocide which is pretty worrying. It's a moral stain, frankly, on European colonial traditions, and it's largely blanked out. It's never told in histories of Europe and the Mediterranean, forgotten. So what I'm going to do with this presentation is first review the classical accounts and the records of first contact from 1312 onwards. Linguistics, at least, point strongly to a connection with the Berbers of the Maghreb, although the extermination of the inhabitants before their language was properly recorded makes this difficult to be sure. Some types of cultural evidence, such as the granaries with door locks on Gran Canaria, point to Berber contact. Other practices, such as mummification, the use of log coffins, body printing stamps, and terracotta images of deities seem to be very local indeed. The Blench may be said to have practiced a sort of minimalist agriculture from 1300 AD onwards. There was barley, wheat, figs, goats, sheep, and pigs. Surprisingly, however, some islands reverted back to foraging, hunting, gathering by the time of medieval era contact. Okay, here's a map of the Canary Islands, give you some idea of how they are scattered around. The Canaries, of course, are known to most people today as a holiday destination, and the great areas are Tenerife and Gran Canaria. But nonetheless, there are museums and excavations and cultural traces on all 7 islands, and these are mainly reported in highly local Spanish literature, so it's often not known to archaeologists, and especially not to archaeologists of North Africa. There are 7 major islands, and there's a handful of islets. They're some 100 kilometers west of Morocco. The date of their first settlement is still disputed. It's generally presumed to be more than 2 millennia ago. The resident populations were the Blench, and there were apparently 4 dialects spread across 7 main islands. The islands were known to classical authors, and indeed, given the mythological status, this is the Garden of the Hesperides, or the Ilae Fortunatae, the Fortunate Isles. The Canaries were apparently visited by numerous maritime peoples, including the Phoenicians, the Romans, and the Arabs. But perhaps surprisingly, these early sources have nothing to say about their presumed inhabitants. By the 14th century, contact with European maritime notions had begun, particularly and mainly with the Mallorcans and the Genoese. External settlement seems to have begun in the early 14th century on Tenerife, and it's at this point that the process of conversion, assimilation, and elimination began. Perhaps ironically or bizarrely, the Europeans found that the local dances were so exciting and entrancing that they actually carried these musical practices back to Europe, and they became part of what we would now call classical music. So, for example, in the harpsichord suites of J.S. Bach, you see dances called Canaries, which can be traced back to the dances of the Guanche people. Unfortunately, the fate of the language and the people was less iconic. By the end of the 18th century, they had disappeared, the speakers were killed and dying either from disease or being assimilated. And my picture shows an extract from the Chronicle of the Canaries, which was a manuscript prepared in 1412, which obviously justifies the European settlement of the Canaries, but it's one of the key pieces of information that we have for the interaction between the Spanish, the Italians, and the native peoples. So it's clear that the Canaries were known to early mariners in the Mediterranean. The first reference to them is in the Periplus of Hanno, which is a Carthaginian voyage summarized in later synopses, including Herodotus. The Greek sailor's manual of a few centuries later, the Pseudo-Skylax, also notes the existence. But strangely, again, none of these sources clearly indicate whether there were any resident indigenes. So our first mention is in Hanno, 6th to 5th century BC. Pseudo-Skylax is 330 BC. Juba II, recorded in Pliny the Elder, 79 AD, but perhaps referring to around 40 AD. And about 1,000 years ago, Ibn Farouk also mentions the Canary Islands. This table is just a quick overview of what we understand to be the indigenous names of the different islands. So I give you the modern name in the first column, the Guanche name of the island, the name of the inhabitants if different, and then the names given to the 7 islands by the Romans in Roman sources such as Pliny. So the isolation of the Canaries comes to an end when the Genoan navigator Lancelotto Molagello settled on the island of Lanzarote in 1312. By 1350, a mission had been established to convert the native populations, and the first attempt to transcribe the Guanche language was the Genoese mariner Nicoloso da Recco in 1341, and he wrote out the lower numerals. The Calisthenian conquest of the Canary Islands began in 1402, when Jean de Betancourt and Gadifer de la Salle landed on the island of Lanzarote. This illustrated chronicle records the conquest of the Guanche and their forcible conversion to Christianity. The Guanche were not just passive victims, they mobilized, they fought back, and in 1494 and 1496, there were 2 battles at Ajentejo. However, they had no metal, as mentioned earlier, and basically they were inevitably going to be defeated by people who had crossbows, later guns, and extremely sharp swords. So we know that there was earlier contact with the Canaries because of archaeological evidence. My picture shows a Roman amphora discovered in the waters off Lanzarote in 1964. And in the 1990s, at the settlement of El Bebedero, also on Lanzarote, there were Roman potsherds, pieces of metal, pieces of glass, and these are between the 1st and 4th centuries. There's been, if we look at the archaeology of the Guanche, there's been excavations at numerous indigenous Guanche settlements, beginning particularly with the opening of the tumuli fields is one of the most distinct features on some of the main islands, it was found that there were mummies inside some of these tumuli. And as a consequence, there was a sort of bizarre competition to excavate them, or excavate's probably a polite word, dig up. So in the museum collections held in the Museo Canario on Gran Canaria and the Museo de la Naturaleza y el Hombre en Tenerife, there are large collections of these mummies. They illustrate a number of the features of pre-colonization and Guanche culture, which we can summarize as follows. A complete lack of metal artifacts, both copper and iron, despite those being well established on the mainland opposite. A thriving and diverse stone culture with considerable variation from one island to another, including rotary grain mills such as those in use in the Maghreb. There was the system of pastoral livestock production. There are pigs, sheep, and goats and dogs, but no cattle on all islands. There was agriculture, barley, wheat, pulses, figs, practiced on 5 of the 7 islands. Surprisingly, there's no evidence for a maritime culture to transport individuals between islands and conduct offshore fisheries. There's a complex culture of ceramic production with strikingly diverse traditions on different islands. The manufacture of idols, as they're referred to in the museums, these are anthropomorphic representations of figures used in religious practice, with no trace that I can see anyway of influence from mainland patterns. In other words, these seem to be entirely local. The mummification of corpses, this was practiced on 2 islands, although it's sometimes said to be similar to ancient Egyptian mummification. Technically speaking, it was really quite different. It does not seem to be related to Egyptian practices. Remarkably, there are rock inscriptions in a script that resembles Numidian in the Maghreb, and these inscriptions divided into 2 layers. One, the earliest type, which resembles the earliest Numidian inscriptions, and the second by somebody who's writers who are obviously familiar with the Roman alphabet, even though it's not written in Latin. It has many features which look like the writers are familiar with Latin. There's no evidence for permanent settlements of any of the other trading cultures mentioned. In other words, although we now know from archaeology the Romans landed there, there's no Roman settlement on any island. And surprising, even more surprising, despite the fact that the islands are surrounded by incredibly rich marine resources, there was no thriving picture of capture fisheries. In other words, people aren't sailing out and capturing fish, they're sitting on the island raising pigs. In the absence of direct dates for settlement, fossil pollen and all that, we can try and capture, direct dates, we can try and capture this through use of fossil pollen and charcoal analysis. So in 2016, the results from La Laguna in Gran Canaria suggest that we have since as much as 4,500 BP, some evidence for changes in the vegetation system. So there are palms, notably the important palm Phoenix canariensis, and junipers, such as Juniperus turbinata. Around 2,300 years ago, the vegetation begins to change, and this may well be evidence of the earlier settlement of the islands. The data shows an increasing frequency of fires at that time. There's a decline in the palms and increase in grasses. All of this is consistent, anyway, with human presence and vegetation transformation. As can be imagined, the endemic fauna of the Canaries was extremely depauperate, and it was mainly rodents, in fact. There was a giant Gran Canary, a giant rat, Canariomes tamarani. This may have gone extinct before European colonization, but that depends on when it was. Similarly, the related Tenerife giant rat, Canary bravoi, seems to have undergone an anthropic extinction. Similarly with the lava mouse, Malpaisomes insularis, and two species of lizard that inhabited Tenerife and La Gomera. All of these have gone extinct, and humans may be guilty. So, we've mentioned that the domestic animals on the Canaries were pigs, dogs, goats, and sheep. Cattle and the plough were introduced in the post-Hispanic era. This suggests that the earliest settlers were related to the pastoral societies of the Maghreb, who kept these species prior to Roman invasion. They milked the ruminants, and one of the archaeological finds that is most striking are the jars of preserved butter, manteca. The name for this seems to be derived directly from Berber. Agriculture was known on all 7 islands of the Canaries, at least from the archaeological record, but by the time of European contact, it had been abandoned on 2 of them, La Gomera and Hierro, and the inhabitants have reverted to pastoralism. The earliest evidence for cultivated crops is at 300 AD at La Tendal on La Palma, with the remains of wheat and barley. Apart from cereals, there's evidence for lentils, peas, and fava beans. These pulses are all quite late. Many of them are from the 14th century onwards and can occur within the window of early or possible European contact. The fig, which can be treated as semi-domestic, was present from the earliest period of crop agriculture. Fisheries. Well, as I mentioned, the Canaries are surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean. Fisheries, however, are extremely low level. They're not fundamental to Guanche subsistence. In the archaeological record, we find small amounts of bone hooks, as shown in the image, but this fishing culture just appears to disappear completely. One intriguing piece of evidence for this is that there are a number of Guanche terms earlier recorded for fish in the literature, but every one of these turns out to be a borrowing from Portuguese or Spanish. In other words, potential fishing people were so uninterested in fishing that they borrowed their fish names from the invaders. As I mentioned, Guanche died out before it could be properly recorded by modern linguistics, so we only have travelers and amateur enthusiasts. The main synthesis is by a guy called Wolfel, who published in German in the 60s, which his work has eventually been translated into Spanish and was published about 15 years ago. So he combed through all the literature, and many of the similarities with Berber and elsewhere are noticed by Ranch. As it turns out, recorded Guanche names for food plants, barley and wheat, correspond to, mainland Berber terms, suggesting an agreement between the linguistic and the archaeological record. So just perhaps to remind you about Berber, Berber is a major branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family, and the languages are spoken both by settled and nomadic populations along the North African coast and far down into the Sahara, presently reaching the borders of Nigeria. And this map gives you some idea about this, way over from Siwa Oasis here, through to these small oases in Libya, up through Tunisia, Algeria, obviously Morocco is an important place for still spoken Berber, and then in the central Sahara, the Tuareg were one of the largest areas, although of course very low density, and then the 2 isolates, one at Zenaga here in the southwest of Mauritania, and Tetzeret are spoken in one town in Niger. I've mentioned that there are rock inscriptions throughout the Canaries. The connection is with Libico-Berber or Numidian, which occurs across the Maghreb. Although the first inscriptions occur in the 3rd century BC, It continues through for 600 years or so, but the texts are all disappointingly short. I mentioned also that if you pull apart the short inscriptions of the Canaries, the early style is quite hard to decipher. Shows parallels with inscriptions in Morocco. The later phase shows familiarity with Latin script. One of the points underlying this talk, which I really want to say, we need to think about a bit harder, is what I'm calling here idiosyncratic material culture. In other words, there are quite a number of things that people used on the Canaries which are not attested on the mainland, and it's a bit of a puzzle to understand where these cultures came from. So, log coffins. Okay, anybody who works in Southeast Asia will be extremely familiar with log coffins, but they're not exactly typical of North Africa, yet they are found in several islands in the Canaries. Grass skirts. Here's a typical grass skirts from the Canary Islands. These are virtually indistinguishable technically from those made in New Guinea, for example, and you can see the grass skirt wearing in some of the early engravings I was pointing to. Stamp seals. So throughout the Canaries, we find these elaborate seals with geometric patterns, such as is shown below. These were apparently printed directly on the body, as well as on granaries and potter and ceramics and other significant items. And intriguingly, nothing like this has ever been recorded from the Moroccan mainland. Mummification, I mentioned mummification, and 4 of the Canary Islands practice mummification really on a rather extensive scale. Again, technically speaking, this does not resemble strongly any of the other mummification traditions, so its origin is a bit of a mystery. DNA, well, DNA, of course, has become extremely fashionable and extremely useful. First work was to look at modern populations and see whether they retain some DNA which will be quite distinct from the European DNA. So the first person I think to do is Machamea. Then Frege et al. Showed that paternal DNA was preferentially eliminated. So there was a certain genocide of males, and then intermarriage between the conquerors and the remaining women. Ancient DNA extracted from human teeth in material from Tenerife and Gran Canaria was dated to between the 7th and 11th centuries, yielding a similar result, indicating strong similarities with Moroccan Berber populations. There's also been a study that the present-day inhabitants also have 7% of Rodrigo. Okay. Pulling this all together, I'm just going to make a summary table. I mentioned the early classical records. I'm guessing, although we have no direct evidence, that there were Phoenician vessels carrying North African and Berber slaves. They were introduced with a view to the populations gathering dyestuffs, and this is something that becomes very important for the Phoenicians, murex and dyestuff, so on. The Juba king lands in 23 AD, but we hear nothing about the Guanche. My guess, we know the Romans are visiting, we're not sure why they're visiting, but my guess is, again, it's connected with the murex. In other words, the purple dyes that are so important in Mediterranean trade. Now, who else is coming? Well, my guess is from 100, 200, 300 AD, North African populations are arriving. They're bringing fig and cereal cultivation techniques. Anything else is a bit of drag. Okay, so I should say about 1000 AD, according to some of the Ibn Farouk records, there's Moroccan contact. It's possible that contact is only with Gran Canaria because we see new architecture, possibly new crops, fortified granaries, rotary mills, and there's apparently a demographic increase on the main island because there's strong evidence for inter-communal violence. In other words, people start constructing clubs and bashing each other on the head with them. European contact begins in 1312, and hence the process of Guanche extinction begins. Right, so there are many questions about the peopling of the Canaries. The most striking one is, why did the Canaries remain in the Neolithic until early European contact? Is this because the Phoenicians and the Romans were shipping North Africans to the Canaries and deliberately keeping their access to low technology in order to assert main control? If a Roman visitor was looking to a future visit, they wanted to maintain superior technology to defend themselves. Why was contact with the mainland of Morocco so limited, and was it responsible for the increased populations at the end of the first millennium? Don't know. Well, research obviously continues on this one. Okay, this is a very short summary of a great deal of material. There's still much to be done in the Canaries. If you get past the whole tourism infrastructure, there's many fascinating things to see. I'd like to thank in particular museums and staff in the Canary Islands for assisting with helping me photograph things. And I was introduced to all this following field trips associated with the International Workshop on African Archaeobotany, which was held in Las Palmas in 2018. So we got to go around the island and look at some of these, and also look at some of the amazing flora of the island. The Canary is very hot for botanical gardens. So all in all, very interesting stuff, and I hope to go back and continue this type of work.